What is the truth? Is it formed by how we feel? Is it based on the behaviors of the culture we live in? Is it founded on the fickleness of the news and media? Is it our perception of the world around us? What if truth is none of those things? What if truth is definitive and uncompromising? What if truth is unable to be altered by anything contrary to God's word? Truth is not confusing, compulsive, or uncontrollable. The word of God is truth. It is our firm foundation, our fixed point of reference for all things truth. Jesus is the truth. His truth is our shield. When we know the truth will set us free. Love rejoices in the truth. We can know the truth. Not what the world says, but what God says. We can live the truth. Setting a standard based on the Bible. We can share the truth, letting others know that the truth has set us free.
We're going to stick with our sermon series we've been doing lately that we're calling Red Letters. We've been looking at different things that John records in his gospel. And if you open up your Bible, if you go to the New Testament, you're going to find the fourth gospel is Matthew, Mark, Luke, then John. If you open up to John, before you ever come across red letters, before you ever get to words that John says Jesus said, before you ever get there, you come across a very bold statement that John makes. It's in John chapter 1, verse 14. He says that the Word became flesh. When he says the Word, he's talking about God. He's saying that God himself became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He came and he lived with us. And John isn't claiming that he heard about it. He's claiming that he experienced it. He said, we've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. John is claiming that he saw God, that he experienced God in a face-to-face, very real way through the person of Jesus. And he says that Jesus came from the Father, that the Word came from the Father, that somehow God sent God. And that when he arrived, he was full of grace and truth. It's a huge verse that deeply shapes who we are as a church. We believe that Jesus didn't skimp on grace. He gave more compassion than expected to everyone. The people who felt like they had zero value found value in the presence of Jesus. He was huge on grace, the fullness of it. And we believe that Jesus didn't skimp on truth. We take this verse very seriously, that Jesus gave truth to all people in all circumstances. And clearly, John believed this as well. Now, we don't know exactly when John writes his gospel. Some people believe that it was around or as early as 65 AD. Some people think that he wrote it as late as 110 AD. Doesn't really matter. John wrote his gospel at least 35 years after Jesus' death, maybe as many as 80 years later. You need to understand that. Because this gospel that John writes, it's not like it was a live thread where he's keeping up with every move that Jesus makes. He's not just constantly updating his Twitter account and then we put it in gospel form, okay? This is a biography, and it's looking back. It's written well after all of these events took place. And when John introduces Jesus, he's looking back. And he looks back at all of his personal experiences, all the things that he did with Jesus, all of it, the composite, the fullness of everything that John experienced led him to this huge conclusion statement. Jesus is the fullness of grace and truth. Truth is a major theme in John's gospel, just as it is in our world today. Now, the definition of truth is simply the property of something being in accordance with fact or reality. Truth is when we communicate what is, in fact and in reality. But what makes this really complicated for us is that in our culture, we've watered down the concept of truth. We've changed it. We've adjusted it to be something that we're more comfortable with. We live in a time where there's ideas that are widely accepted, ideas like these. What's true for you may not be true for me. Maybe you've said that. Maybe you've heard someone say that, right? Or maybe this one, I'm just living out my truth. We've taken the concept of something that exists in fact and something that exists in reality, but we've shifted it to a different meaning. And I think it's because sometimes we don't like facts. Sometimes we don't like reality. We don't like what truth means for us personally, and so we've watered down truth to be something that we can live with. It's a philosophy that's rooted in something called postmodernism, and it's greatly shaped our culture. Postmodernism says that truth is subjective. There's no such thing as an objective reality. There is no objective fact. And it starts with the removal of absolute authority. Because if there is no God, that means that there is no absolute authority. And that means that there's no voice to declare what is truth and what is not truth. And then everyone has the opportunity to define truth for themselves. No ultimate authority means no absolute truth. And no absolute truth means that there's no higher value, no higher authority than myself. So I can adjust truth in whichever way my opinion takes it. And then our opinions grow into voices of truth. It's why we started just a moment ago with Jordan and this whole idea of change my mind. Because we all have hot takes. We all have opinions that we think are true. And we're so confident, we're so correct in our knowledge of truth that we challenge anyone else to come along and change our minds, right? Because my opinions are not just simply opinions or perspectives. It's the truth that I live by. And I'm so confident in that truth that I try to convince you to live by my truth. My truth should be your truth. And you've seen this play out in all sorts of different things that exist within our culture right now. You've seen this in sports and politics. I've reached the point where I can't hardly stand to watch ESPN. I love sports, and that's really all I'd like to watch. But it's not ESPN like I remember it. It's not SportsCenter that's just showing the highlights and the clips of all the games that I want to see what happened. It's not the specific shows that are dealing with the news within each specific sport. It's not any of those kinds of things. Now it's just random people screaming and arguing with each other about their opinions and their own little hot takes. And I don't find that appealing at all, primarily because they're wrong. I actually know better than they do. Like it's aggravating to hear them argue and be so wrong, right? And it's the same with politics. If you go to any news station, all they're going to do is just promote the already accepted ideal. Just argue and yell their point, right? And you've seen this play out in art and entertainment. I love abstract art, not because I find it moving, but because I find it hilarious. It allows anyone to just come up and look at it, and they have their own meaning, and your opinion is great just as much as anybody else's opinion, right? And entertainment does this as well, whether that's music or whether it's movies and TV. Entertainment is constantly feeding an opinion packaged as truth. Even entertainers themselves are constantly pushing their opinions, constantly pushing their beliefs and their truths. You've seen this play out in sexuality and gender. Each limit to human sexuality that has ever existed or currently exists seems to be becoming very quickly obsolete, being pressed right past, where opinions become truth. There's even a common debate in our world right now as to the definition of words like man and woman. How can we know what any of these words mean without a clear understanding of truth? Things that we've understood for millennia are now suddenly complicated because of our source of truth, and it's shifted. You're watching this play out right now in real time with stuff like AI and the dangers of what artificial content could potentially be creating. There's a growing paranoia about our content and whether or not it's actually real or authentic. And so if there is no absolute authority and if there is no absolute truth, then our opinions grow into our truths. And if our truths are in conflict, if you and I have conflict in our truths, how could we ever know who's right and who's wrong? But what if there is a God? What if there is a God who does define absolute truth? And wouldn't it be nice if this God let us know what truth is? Is there such a thing as absolute truth, the capital T type of truth? Is there any truth that applies to all people at all times in all circumstances? And if someone claims to have that truth, how can we know that they're right? How would we know that we can trust them? Truth is a major theme in our world today, just as it was where we started in John's gospel. One of the last questions that John records being asked of Jesus is from a guy named Pilate. Pilate was a Roman authority, a governor. His authority put him in position to interrogate Jesus at the end of his life. So Jesus is arrested by the Jews. He's put on trial. Now they bring him before Pilate because Pilate's the guy who has the authority to execute Jesus. And Pilate's also the guy who has the authority to set him free. So Pilate asked Jesus a great question. He says, some people say that you're a king. Is that true? And that's a big question because Pilate is kind of like a king. If Jesus is a king, then he's a threat to Pilate and Pilate's kingdom. Jesus says, you're right in saying that I'm a king. He says, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world. This is such a huge moment. Jesus is about to give Pilate the big picture idea of who he is as a man. And he's saying, this is why I was born. This is why I exist. This is why I came into the world. He says, to testify to the truth. Jesus, according to him, exists for the purpose of testifying to the truth. And then he says, everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. That's an audacious claim. It's a huge statement. Especially to the man who has the authority over you to decide whether you live or die. That's a huge, audacious claim. Jesus claimed that he existed for the purpose of telling the truth, and that if you don't agree with him, then you're wrong. It's a change my mind moment, right? He draws a line in the sand. If you aren't on Jesus' side, then you're on the side of not truth. And then Pilate asks one of the most incredible questions. It's maybe the best question that's ever been asked to the most qualified person to answer this question in all of history. Pilate asks him, what is truth? It's a good question. It's a question our culture's wrestling with big time. John writes a lot about truth because Jesus said a lot about truth. 25 different times, John records Jesus saying, truly, truly. Some translations write it out as, I tell you the truth. And usually when Jesus says, I tell you the truth, he immediately follows it up with something that is so hard to accept that he has to preface it with, listen, I'm telling you the truth, because it doesn't sound believable. And we can't look at all 25 examples today, but we can bring our attention to a couple. And it's going to be stuff like this. In John 5:19, he says, I tell you the truth. This is a big deal. Jesus is drawing your attention. He's saying, look, here's some truth that I'm giving you. I need you to pay attention. This is an opportunity for you to lean in. I'm giving some truth. And he says the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. It's a weird statement. Of all the true statements to make, he makes a statement about the relationship between a father and a son. And it's kind of strange, and I don't know if it's even necessarily true, right? Because my sons do all sorts of things that I don't do. And I do all sorts of things that they don't do. And it doesn't even seem to make sense. Something bigger is going on. Jesus isn't talking about fathers and sons, he's talking about God, and he's claiming that he's God's son. And he claims that anything he does matches what the Father does. Jesus says that what he does are the things that God does, which is an audacious statement. And then he makes some claims after that. He says that the Father raises the dead, and he says that the Son will be the judge over everyone. The Father's not the one who's going to judge all people. He's going to give that authority to his Son, and he's claiming to be the Son. He's claiming that he's going to have the right to judge everyone. And he says if you don't honor the Son, then you're not honoring the Father. Strange things, audacious, hard stuff to accept and believe. It's big, difficult truth, isn't it? How can we know that he's telling the truth? Why can we believe him in his claims of truth over anyone else's claims of truth? If you finish this verse, it finishes with this phrase, who sent him? He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. If Jesus was sent by God, then it isn't so crazy to talk about raising the dead and judging everyone, is it? John records this strategy of Jesus all throughout his gospel. Jesus will consistently make truth claims, and then he connects himself back to the Father, back to God. Jesus is saying there is an authority, and there is an absolute authority. There is someone who can say what is true and what isn't true. And Jesus claims to know him and to be from him. But is that the truth? It's a big claim. Maybe the hardest true statement that Jesus makes comes in John chapter 6. He's teaching to a large crowd and he tells them, I tell you the truth. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. That's not a weird statement. That's a terrifying statement, right? That's a scary thing to say. This is the language of cults. This is the language of a crazy man. And he doesn't just say it once. I think every time he says it, you almost like see the disciples like wince in fear, like, oh, don't say that, right? He doesn't just say it once. He says it 5 times. He repeats it 5 more times in the next 5 verses. Verse 54, he says, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. 55, for my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. 56, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in him. 57, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. 58, your forefathers ate manna and died, but he who feeds on this bread will live forever. It's weird. It's real weird. And if you keep reading the story, the very next little part, verse 60, says, on hearing this, many of his disciples said, this is hard teaching. Who can accept it? Yeah, duh, right? It is. It's weird. It's awkward. No kidding. This guy is standing in front of you saying that you have to eat him. That is difficult. Kind of awkward. A few verses down, verse 66, it says, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. I bet they did. I think the moment when you tell people that they have to start eating your flesh and drinking your blood, that may be the moment that some people say, I'm out. It's weird. Even the disciples who stick around with Jesus, they're not real comfortable with this. They don't leave in the moment, but they got some questions, man. And they're second guessing. It's real weird. And the whole thing, the whole section of it starts with Jesus saying, I tell you the truth. Jesus says this is the truth. How can we know he's telling the truth? Why can we believe him in his claims of truth over anyone else's claims of truth? Why? In the middle of these strange statements about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, I skipped right past something. It's in verse 57. He says, just as the living Father sent me. He's bringing our attention back to this fact that he was sent by God. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. Jesus ties it back to the higher authority. He ties it back to God who sent him to do this work. Jesus connects authority to know the truth directly to his Father, and that he was sent by God to proclaim this truth. Jesus says there is an absolute authority. There is someone who can say what is true and what isn't true. And Jesus claims to know him, and Jesus claims to be from him. But is that the truth? Jesus knew the reason you should take him seriously is because he was sent by the Father. He knew the truth was going to be a challenge to us, and he knew the truth was going to be hard to hear. And so he kept reminding us of who sent him. And he knew that many would walk away from him because it wouldn't make sense until much, much later. His disciples needed time to pass, and they needed the ability to look back. And then some of these things would begin to make sense. Like these words about eating flesh and drinking blood, they only make sense after the Last Supper and after the start of the church. But it doesn't make sense because enough time had passed where people became comfortable with the idea of eating flesh and drinking blood. That's not what changed. No, these words start to make sense because he walked out of the grave. The resurrection changes everything. The reason we believe Jesus can do what God can do, The reason we believe that Jesus isn't insane for telling us to eat his flesh and drink his blood. The reason we believe Jesus was sent from God is because he walked out of the tomb. He died. He was buried. His tomb was guarded and protected. And he rose back to life and walked out. And we don't believe that that's just some story that's been told. We believe it because the first century church believed in the resurrection and it changed their lives, and they believed it because they saw it. There's one guy called Doubting Thomas because there was a moment when all the other disciples saw Jesus after the resurrection, but Thomas wasn't there. And so Thomas doubts. You would too. Seeing people alive after they've been dead isn't normal. And so he demands to see it for himself, and then he does. But it was more than just seeing. They lived with the resurrected Jesus. They spent time with him. They talked with him. They ate with him. And they started a movement that was built on that testimony. The resurrection of Jesus is the central core piece to why they believed all of the other things that Jesus said. And they held tightly to that belief. They testified to what they saw. They even died for what they saw. They refused to change their testimony, even under pressure or promise of death, because they knew what they had seen and experienced. And that's the testimony that laid the foundation for the church. When every other thing tried to kill the church, every other political institution, every other religious institution tried to work against the church and create as many obstacles as possible, and yet the church thrives and grows. There's persecution and even martyrdom, and yet the church stayed faithful to the message of Jesus, not because it made sense in the world that they lived in, and it's not because all of a sudden eating flesh and drinking blood makes sense. It continued to exist and it grew because Jesus proved his authority by walking out of the tomb. It changes everything. And the reason we believe that there is an absolute truth, the reason we believe Jesus has authority in our lives to tell us truth, is because Jesus walked out of the grave. The reason we believe Jesus has absolute truth isn't because of what he said, but because of what he did, which proves who he is. In 1995, there was a phrase that was first introduced: food desert. It refers to low-income communities where residents have limited access to affordable and nutritious food. Often it's going to lead them to reliance on processed and unhealthy options. So in especially urban areas where there's not a place where they can grow their own food, you're going to see what becomes described as a food desert. And there's been a movement ever since this term was first coined to create opportunities, to create situations where food can be grown locally in these spaces to help people have access to better quality food. Food deserts. Even in the most advanced and developed places on earth. I think we live in a truth desert. I think we live in a world where thoughts like, what's true for you may not be true for me exist. We live in a world where thoughts like, I'm just living out my truth, that's a normal thought. Truth, real truth, absolute truth is becoming more and more scarce. And our world is living off of processed truth, unhealthy truth, truth without nutrition or value, truth that won't actually sustain. It may satisfy your hunger for a time, but it won't give you what you're looking for. In a world that we live in today where truth has become far more limited, where truth is much harder to find, there's a statement that's going to ruffle some feathers, but I think Jesus said it first. Your truth doesn't matter if it doesn't match Jesus' truth. Your truth doesn't matter if it doesn't match Jesus' truth. You can press your opinion, you can have an idea, you can lean into what you say is true for you, but if it doesn't match his truth, then it's like living off of a processed and unhealthy options. It's going to satisfy you for a little bit, but it's going to bring health issues in the future. It isn't going to accomplish what you want in the long term. And so some of you need to hear Jesus' words from John chapter 8. He says, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I think our culture right now is looking for freedom. I think some of you are looking for freedom. You're looking for truth. You're trying to find the right way to live. And Jesus makes this promise. If you would just do the things he says, if you would just buy into his teaching, then you're going to find the truth, and then you're going to find that freedom that you so desperately crave. Oftentimes we push away from the truth of God because we think it restricts, makes life harder, makes life more difficult, more constrained. That's not truth. That's actually a lie, I believe, straight from Satan. When we accept the truth of God, the authority of God, it actually brings us freedom. You want freedom by living out your truth, but you're not going to find it. You're looking for freedom from what's true to you, but you won't find it there. Real truth, absolute truth, the truth of God is what can give you the freedom that you so desperately are looking for. And it's what Pilate missed. Remember him from the beginning. Pilate asked that incredible question to Jesus, he asked, what is truth? And he asks it to the one guy who's the most qualified to have answered that question. It's such a huge moment. Pilate asked the Son of God, what is truth? It's an incredible opportunity. And I bet you would love to see Jesus' response, right? Surely in this moment, Jesus is going to say something that's just amazing. It's going to open our eyes to understanding truth in some incredible, powerful way. Surely, however Jesus answers this question is going to be life-changing for us as soon as we hear it, right? It's one of the saddest things you're going to read in Scripture. When Pilate asks the question, it's almost like he mumbles it as he walks away. We don't have an answer from Jesus because Pilate walks out of the room. Jesus tells him, I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And it's like Pilate goes, what's truth? As he's walking out the door to go talk to the Jews who are trying to convince him that it's time to kill Jesus. He had him right there, man. He was so close, but he missed it. He had the opportunity, and he missed it. Don't miss it today. Truth, real truth, is yours, and it can set you free. Now, maybe you're a follower of Jesus already. Maybe you've already bought into his truth, and you see yourself as being a part of what he's trying to do in this world. You recognize that just because his mission was to testify to the truth, your mission is to testify to the truth. Church, I want you to see that we have an incredible opportunity. We have what the rest of the world is desperately needing. We live in a truth desert, and we have truth. We have the thing that so many people want, that so many people are looking for. One time, Jesus was asked this. It's in John chapter 6. Someone asks him, what must we do to do the works God requires? What are the things that we're supposed to do if we're going to bring joy to God or if we want to meet his expectations? And there's lots of things that Jesus could have said, lots of ways he could have answered it, but he answered it this way. He says, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. Goes back to that sent part we talked about earlier. He's telling the truth, and he's reminding us that he was sent by God, that's why we can trust that what he says is the truth. The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. Church, what must you do to do the works of God? Have you started believing the truth from the one God sent? But don't just believe it for yourself. You've got to live this in such a way. Live out your belief in such a way that it leads other people to believe in the one he has sent. That's our purpose. To bring truth into this world, to offer truth to the world. Jesus calls it light and darkness. We live in a dark world. We live in a truth desert. We've got to live the light of this truth, of who he is and what he's done in this world. And so maybe you haven't accepted Jesus. Maybe you haven't had a moment in your life where you've accepted the truth that he's given. We'd love for you to make that decision today. It's really cool. We've already had one baptism this morning. Before the service even began, we have a couple more scheduled right now. We have more throughout the morning as it goes. It's an incredible opportunity. If you're ready to accept truth, let's come accept truth. Let's come start a relationship with Jesus and what that looks like. I want to invite you to a conversation with me. I'd love to have that. We got everything you need to make a decision for following Jesus today. Maybe you just need prayer. Maybe you recognize that you haven't been living out truth. If you need that, I'd love to pray with you. We have an elder in our prayer room who'd like to pray with you, whatever you may need. I'll challenge you How big is truth in your life? Where do you find truth? Are you finding it from the one true source? Are you finding it from Jesus? Or are you looking in every other place instead? Let that weigh on your minds. Let's stand. Let's sing.